delighted to welcome you all today to this event, in celebration of the International Women's Day 2022, which is tomorrow. But this is sort of a week of celebration leading to the International Women's Day. So the JNCSR is a autonomous institute funded by Department of Science and Technology, and with a focus on research in material science and biology. JNCSR has 40% of its students as women students, and about 20% of its faculty are women faculty members. There is a lot of room to improve this, and in fact, indeed, JNC is serious about improving gender balance among all of its population. So Ministry of Women and Child Development is celebrating the International Women's Day along with many other bodies on March 8, 2022 under the umbrella of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And in response to a request by this ministry, Department of Science and Technology and most of its institutes are celebrating a week of events leading to the International Women's Day tomorrow. At JNCSR, this event is organized by Gati, Gender Advancement of Transforming Institutions. It's an innovative project, pilot project launched by Department of Science and Technology on the National Science Day, 28 February 2020. And it is a novel intervention program for promoting gender equity in science and technology. The project Gati aims to nudge institutions of higher education and research towards supporting diversity, inclusion, and the full spectrum of demographic talent for their own success and progression. Having this balanced representation is important to any institution and not just for a particular section of population. In particular, it aspires to create enabling environment for equal participation of women in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics disciplines at all levels. Today's program, organized by Gati at JNCSR and Professor Jain and her team, is the Science by Women Scientists, a symposium to celebrate International Women's Day 2022 today. It showcases and highlights women's achievements in science and technology. And secondly, one of the goals is to eliminate gender-based discrimination and work towards empowerment of women in science and technology. Indeed, the panel discussion at the end of the event today, I'm sure will stimulate interesting ideas towards accomplishing this goal. And before delaying you any further, I'll request Professor Jain to take over now.
Okay. So thank you, Umesh, for welcoming our panelists and our speakers. So we'll start the scientific session. So we have three exciting talks by three excellent speakers in physics, chemistry, and biology. And we'll start with the talk by Professor Ranjini Bandapadhyay. So Ranjini obtained her PhD in physics from IISc in 2001, and then she worked at UCLA and Johns Hopkins University for her postdoc. She has been a faculty at IIR since 2005, and she's currently a professor there. She's interested in understanding the properties of soft matter experimentally, and that's what she will talk about today. So Ranjini is on the editorial board of various leading journals, such as Scientific Reports. She is also a founder alumna of Global Young Academy, which is an organization that aims to be the voice for young scientists and encourages international, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary collaboration dialogue. Okay, so Ranjini, we'll start with you. So your talk is for 25 minutes, and I'll allot you 20 minutes.
Okay, so thank you, Umesh. Thank you, Kavita. This is a very exciting meeting for me. I mean, it's a fantastic occasion. It's also my first physical meeting after 2 years. So that makes it very special. So can I have something like a laser pointer? Is there anything? Or if it's not there, it's okay. I'll just use the cursor here. Yeah. So today, I'm going to tell you about some recent experiments that, I have a group in RRL, so we do experiments on the flows of materials. And I'll tell you about some recent work that we've done on what happens when one material displaces another material. So I work on what are called non-Newtonian materials. So these are materials that are liquid-like and solid-like at 12 timescales that are accessible to us. So just to give you a few examples, these soft materials are pretty much, all the day-to-day materials that we use, like, lotions, creams, food stuff. Most of these are soft materials. So these are materials that, they're not just viscous like water, but they're also a little elastic, okay? So it has both components, which is why it's called viscoelastic. So I'm going to tell you about how these materials flow in confinement. And okay, thanks. Yeah, so my name is Ranjini, and I'm at the Raman Research Institute, and this is work that I did with two of my present PhD students, Palak and Vaibhav, and Devashish, who is now a postdoc at the University of Dusseldorf. So we look at how materials flow. This is what is called the science of rheology, okay? So rheology is basically the discipline that looks at these viscoelastic materials. So we look at the flow, as you know, is a liquid-like property, but then, and deformation is a solid-like property. So in rheology, we look at both these things together, okay? Now, what we are going to do here is that we're going to take a confined geometry, and we're going to take some viscoelastic material, and I'll tell you what that material is in a moment, and we're going to displace it with a Newtonian liquid here, water or oil, right? So these are materials that follow Newton's law of viscosity. Okay, and we're going to generate these fantastic patterns using only only one pair of, these fluids, okay? But, where the viscoelastic fluid is aging. So, its properties are spontaneously evolving, and I'll tell you why that happens. Okay, so now we've been looking at displacements, like I've already told you, and there's been a lot of work that's been done on displacements for the last 50 or 60 years. But this is what, this was work on the displacement of one viscous fluid, that is a Newtonian fluid, by another. Now, we look at how materials flow, and we also know what happens when a more viscous fluid displaces a less viscous fluid. Many of you might have heard of, something called a Saffman-Taylor instability. Okay, so that's a viscous instability. So, so you have these magnificent patterns that develop at the, at interfaces between these two laws that are governed by something called Darcy's law. Okay, so now, as I've written here, that the displacement of a more viscous fluid by a less viscous fluid renders the fluid-fluid interface unstable and leads to these beautiful patterns at interfaces. And if you look at this picture on the right here, the right bottom, you see these tongues here, right? So this is basically air that is invading glycerol. Okay, so this picture that I have, I've just taken it as Saffman and Taylor's, seminal paper on viscous instabilities. Okay, so, and as you can see, so when you push air into glycerol, both are Newtonian, right? But as you can see, the interface between the glycerol and the water, that is not uniform, it's not homogeneous, but it forms these tongues, okay? And indeed, this is a property that, we encounter all the time. For instance, in oil recovery. Okay, so when we recover oil, for instance, they might want to push in water. Okay, and the water, it kind of proceeds in tongues. Okay, it makes these kind of fingers. Okay, we call them fingers because they're kind of broad here. Okay, now what I show you is that instead of pushing water in another Newtonian liquid, if we put water in some viscoelastic material, I mean, you get this zoo of beautiful, beautiful patterns. Okay, so now patterns are very interesting, and why do patterns arise? Patterns arise because of a system's need to kind of optimize its functions. And just to give you an example, so you see the tree here on the left bottom. So it has branches to maximize, its intake of sunlight. So here you see in the middle a picture of a bronchial airway tract. So that has branches too, so that there is maximal scope of diffusion of gases, right? So patterns are, there's a reason why patterns occur, and I show you, how you can kind of control these patterns, because sometimes it's, in these cases, for instance, in the human airway tract or for the branches of the trees, patterns are useful. But in certain cases, patterns are not useful. For instance, I told you about oil recovery, right? So there the patterns that form, the tongues of air that form, that actually reduces the efficiency of recovery of oil. Okay, so in certain cases, patterns are good, and in certain cases, you actually need to stabilize your interface. Okay, you need to suppress these patterns. But here, just to be able to understand our patterns, we're just going to control how these patterns, how they form and, how they evolve. Okay, so today in my talk, I'll not really tell you about the dynamics of the patterns, the kinetics of pattern growth, but it's a short talk, but I'll just, show you some videos, but we'll just stick to the structures, okay? The morphologies of the patterns and how to control them. So as I told you, I'm going to be using a Newtonian liquid to displace a non-Newtonian or a viscoelastic fluid. Okay, so we are going to use two pairs of Newtonian liquids. One will be water and the other will be oil, and this water and oil will basically be dyeing with something that dyes these two materials, just so that we have a very clear interface. Okay, and the water or the oil in separate experiments, it's going to displace a non-Newtonian liquid and the non-Newtonian fluid, let's just say. And the non-Newtonian fluid that I use here is clay. Okay, clay is a colloidal suspension. By clay, it's just a component of mud. Okay, so that is colloidal. It's a very interesting molecule because it in suspension, that is when you take clay particles and you dissolve them in water. Okay, it forms what is called a suspension that ages. Okay, I'll tell you why that happens. So this is the structure of a clay molecule. It's an inorganic molecule. It has a layered structure. We're not exactly interested in the details yet. Okay, and there's no time. But then if you look at a clay particle, it looks like a platelet. Okay, you see this at the bottom. So it's basically, so what we use here is not natural clay. We have worked on natural clays. You've all heard of bentonite and kaolinite and all these clays. They are a lot larger. But what we use here is what is called laponite. Okay, laponite is a synthetic clay. It's like a designer clay. Okay, so it has the same chemical composition, but then it's kind of cooked under, pressure cooker circumstances, okay? So as a result of that, you get these particles that are highly monodisperse in size, okay? So all these clay particles, so we can just buy these particles off the shelf. They are about these, they're platelets, okay? They are disc-like in shape, 25 to 30 nanometers across and 1 nanometer wide. Okay, and as you can see, there are some, so there are some over here also, you can see that there are some sodium ions on the surfaces, okay, on the flat surfaces. So when you put this in water, okay, when you put such a particle in water, the sodium ions, they diffuse out into the water and they form an electrical Debye layer around the particle. So when you have many of these particles in water, okay, the Debye layers, they repulsively interact. Okay, and if you put enough laponite particles in your water, you end up with a colloidal glass. Okay, you end up with a jammed system. It's a very, very, densely, you end up with this system which is kinetically constrained, okay, which shows all kinds of, dynamics that you expect from glasses, okay. Some of you might have heard of the beta relaxation, the alpha relaxation, okay. So you see all that, but this is a colloidal glass. So things happen actually at time scales that are accessible in the laboratory. Okay, as opposed to window glass where, there are two kinds of dynamics. It's either too slow or it's too fast. But we know how to engineer these materials. So then we can make these colloidal glasses, which are very well accessible in the laboratory. And using these glasses, we can actually verify theories of glasses that were provided in the 1960s, okay, but which were very difficult to verify experimentally with molecular glasses. Okay, so how do we get these clay particles? Like I told you, for those of you who do experiments, you have all heard of Sigma Aldrich. So we just buy the powder. Okay, and when you get the powder, it's not all individual particles. Okay, these are like you get them in stacks called, these one-dimensional stacks called tactoids. And when you put these tactoids in water, okay, they get hydrated. Okay, they start swelling. So these are the clay particles here. Okay, so the sodium ions, okay, so I told you that, it has sodium on its surfaces. So the interlayer gallery of these, clay particles, which are kind of, like associated in these tactoids, you have these sodium ions. Now, when you put this tactoid in water, there's an osmotic pressure difference that, that kind of evolves. And as a result of which, the tactoid swells. Okay, and the sodium ion, it comes out. Okay, so there's this, and for all of you, who are cat lovers like I am, that's how cat litter works. Okay, you use clay. right? And so the moment you moisten it, it swells. Okay, so it's the same thing, it's just, much fancier clay, that's all. Okay, so the clay swells, and then once the distance between the two clay platelets, it becomes larger than the distance over which van der Waals interaction works, the clay particles start peeling off from the edges. Okay, so this is a process of exfoliation that happens, and eventually if you wait long enough, all the clay particles should kind of start falling apart from their tactiles, and you'll end up with this repulsive glass. Okay, so basically this, the interactions in this material among these clay particles, they are always evolving as long as you're doing experiments. And because these interparticle interactions are evolving, you see that their response, their mechanical response is also evolving. Okay, for instance, and I'll just show you some data. So if you take some clay particles and you put them in water and you just watch it, okay, you're going to see that it spontaneously transforms from a liquid to a solid. And this is what I meant. So see this on the left, what you see here, this is when we just made a clay suspension. So we just took some clay particles and we mixed it very well in water. And as you can see, we just tilted that vial here and you can see that, it's flowing like water, right? Look at the interface. Yeah. So, so if so at the concentrations that we have worked on here, the viscosity over here, immediately after preparation of the clay suspension, this is about 10 times the viscosity of water, which is not much. Okay. And after that, we just kind of just let the vial be. We just, wrapped it with paraffin to make sure that there's no evaporation at all. And then when we come back the next day, take the same vial, nobody has messed around with it, just turn it over and it has become a solid. Okay, it can support its own weight. And that is because of this, this gradual transformation that happens from a colloidal liquid to a colloidal glasses due to the evolution of the interparticle, the electrostatic interactions that I just told you about. So now, if we take a suspension like this, okay, and we put it in a rheometer. So a rheometer is basically a machine which can apply a stress and it can measure the strain and it can tell you what the elasticity and viscosity contributions of the material are. Okay, so I should just tell you that, G prime, okay, in this rheological parlance, G prime is the real part of the response. So that's the elastic modulus, and G double prime is the imaginary part of the response. So here we use oscillatory stresses. Okay, and that is the viscous response. So now if you just take a clay suspension, make it, just put it in a rheometer and you just let it calculate the elastic and viscous contributions of the material over hours. Okay, so here we've done this over a day and you can see, so this is, TW is the time since preparation. We call it the aging time. We measure it in hours. So you can see we've gone up to 30 hours here and we measure the elastic and viscous moduli. So this curve, okay, the hollow circles, this is the viscous modulus and this is the elastic modulus. And there you can see that it is just spontaneously evolving. Okay, and this spontaneous evolution tells you about, you can indirectly find out about, how the interactions are developing microscopically. Okay, so this measurement that I'm showing you, this is a bulk measurement. Okay, but then looking at the bulk measurement, you can actually, indirectly, you can, hypothesize on what is happening at length scales that are about 7 decades smaller. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So now let me tell you how we look at our confined flows. Okay, so many of you might have heard of Healy Shaw and his cell. Okay, so here we do our experiments in confinement in what is called a radial Healy Shaw cell. So this is what the experimental setup is. Honestly, you can do it in a kitchen. Okay, so we take these glass plates. So here you see this, the sky blue, these are the 2 glass plates and they're separated by a tiny gap of 170 microns. How do we make that little gap? We just take, some some cover slips, okay, microscopes, cover slips or Teflon tapes, and we just make that gap, okay, so that the gap is constant throughout. And we are doing our imaging from the bottom. On the top plate, there's a little hole in the center. Okay, so what do? So we use a syringe pump, and first we're going to inject the non-Newtonian liquid or the fluid. In this case, that is clay. So that is this purple, the purple color that you see here. So this is just a cartoon. So first we inject the non-Newtonian fluid, the clay, then we wait for some time, because as you saw that the rheology or the elasticity, viscosity of the clay suspension, it is spontaneously evolving, right? So then we just let the material, the clay, initially we just let it evolve for, say, we've gone from 1 hour to 24 hours, and then we push in the second phase, which is our Newtonian liquid, okay? So that is this red liquid that we have here. So we put the purple liquid, which is non-Newtonian, we wait for a little bit, 1 hour to 24 hours, and then we squeeze in, we inject the red fluid, which is the Newtonian liquid. In this case, we've used water, dyed water and dyed oil. So what's the difference? Why did we use both? Because see, Laponite, as I have already told you, when we make clay suspension, these are aqueous suspensions. So we made the Laponite suspension in water, right? So when we are pushing in the second liquid as well, which is water, that is what is called a miscible displacement, okay? But when we are pushing in oil as the second liquid, that is an immiscible displacement, because as you know, oil does not mix in water. There is an interfacial tension. And I'll just show you what happens at the interface between the Newtonian liquid and the non-Newtonian fluid, okay, as the age of this purple clay suspension, it increases. And it's just, I'm going to tell you before I even show you, just watching these, things evolve, it just makes so much sense to be an experimental physicist working on soft matter. Okay. So all that aside, I hope you agree with me. So let me tell you a little bit about the materials which we are working with. So one of the materials, like I told you, was a clay suspension, yes. Seriously? Okay. So one of them is a clay suspension, which is shear thinning. It's non-Newtonian, so the viscosity decreases with shear rate. I've got to go really fast here. And for water and mineral oil, as you can see, nothing like that happens, right? There's no change when you change the rate of shear. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens when you displace these clay suspensions, which have been waiting outside, for 1 hour, 3 hours, and 24 hours with water, which is the miscible solvent. So here you go. Okay, so this is what we call a dense viscous pattern. So it's a highly viscous pattern. Okay, because so this is the red, here is the water, as you would have figured out. Outside we have clay, which is non-Newtonian. But remember, the clay here is a very young suspension, right? We've just kind of put it, introduced it. Therefore, the clay is practically viscous. So what you get is a viscous displacement here. Now, as the age of this gray suspension, which is clay, increases, this is what we get. It's the same clay, okay? Except that, we are just kind of, we are introducing the second fluid at a later time. And we get these dendritic patterns. So here, in this first case, we had a lot of merging of branches and, side branching and stuff like that. Here, the kinetics completely changes, okay? So here we have tip splitting. Okay, I don't have time to tell you about all this. I'm happy to talk to you about it later. So here, now the clay suspension has waited for 24 hours before we introduced our water. Okay, and just see what happens here. You get a viscoelastic fracture. This is exactly what you'd get if you take a stone and you hit the stone against the window. Okay, but here look at the time scales at which it is evolving. It's so much slower because clay is a colloidal glass. Okay, so here, this is a fantastic system that you can use to look at, the dynamics of crack formation. Okay, these are very difficult experiments with, the normal systems. Okay, so, why does this start again? Okay, so now we've done this at many ages. Okay, so we've put a clay suspension, we've displaced it with water, and then we've got all these patterns. Okay, now let's see what happens if instead of a miscible displacement, we have an immiscible displacement. Okay, now here again, the gray part is water and we displace it with oil. Okay, now there's an interfacial tension. So when the Laponite suspension is young, it's only 1 hour since, it was injected. So the Laponite suspension is much more viscous than it is elastic. This is what you see. This is gorgeous. So initially, there's a stable interface, okay? There are no fingers. That's because the viscosity of the outer phase and the inner phase, it's almost comparable, okay? But later on, see, as this is happening, I think it stopped. No, it didn't, yeah. See, the clay, you know, as the oil, the red oil that you see here, as it is propagating outward, the clay suspension is also aging. Its elasticity is increasing. So eventually, you see these, you know, these little, you know, pores and protrusions that develop. We call this a flower pattern, okay? So if you look at them, you know, once they're fully developed, I don't have time. I have only maybe 2 minutes left. So it looks like a flower. And here we waited with the clay for 24 hours. So it's very elastic. So here you get something that we call a jag pattern. This is because clay is what is called an yield stress fluid here, okay? So if you want the clay to flow, okay, you want to apply a stress called the yield stress. This is exactly why toothpastes flow only after you apply a little bit of stress, okay? Because a toothpaste is a similar material. Okay, so this is where, you know, so it's all, you know, these are materials, like I told you, that we use all the time. But you can see what happens when you displace these very regular fluids, okay, just by using clay suspensions as a model system. Okay, I'm going to go really fast. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the details anymore. Okay, so here, so these are all the patterns we've gotten for the immiscible displacement. So here the age of the outside clay suspension is increasing. Okay, and okay, so here what have we done with the patterns? Yeah, so we have quantified it by finding out something called an area ratio. So I'll just stick to that. So here is our pattern. So we draw a radius around it. So a circle around it, and the radius of that circle is the length of the longest finger that we could find. Okay, so then we find the area of the circle, and that area divides the area of the pattern, which is the, you know, the number of pixels that are the camera pixels that are occupied by that pattern. And we do this for every pattern. Okay, and we wait. This keeps. Okay, and we find this area ratio versus age of the outside clay suspension for all the different, you know, the patterns that we got. Okay, and after that, you know, we've also done another thing. So we've kept the age of the clay suspension outside constant, but we've changed the flow rate of the oil or the water. And we find that we can generate the same sequence of patterns, okay, by keeping even the elasticity outside constant, but by changing the flow rate of the displacing fluid. And why is that? Because the flow rate of the displacing fluid, when you're changing that, you're changing the shear rate on the, you know, the non-Newtonian fluid outside. So that is shear thinning. Okay, so doing these things, you know, using these very, you know, simple tricks, you can actually control the patterns that you get at interfaces, and you can even stabilize them. Would you like me to wind up, or shall I just show a phase diagram that we made? Okay, last one, promise, yeah, right? So, okay. Okay, so then, you know, we've done the same kind of quantification even when we change the flow rate. And having done so, we have made a phase diagram. Okay, so here's a three-dimensional phase diagram. It has three axes, okay? One is the interfacial tension is equal to 0. One is interfacial tension is not equal to 0. This axis that you see here, this is the age of the outside clay suspension. So this is basically a measure of the elasticity. And Q here is the flow rate of the displacing Newtonian fluid. So that tells you about the shear rate that you have applied. And now when we look at we find that on this phase diagram, this three-dimensional phase diagram, we can actually segregate all the patterns. Okay, so the different colors that you see here, you know, you see this color bar over here. So as you go from here to here, you're basically going from viscoelastic fractures all the way to the dense viscous patterns. So no matter what the age of your clay suspension, what the flow rate of the displacing fluid or the surface tension, you can actually predict, okay, what patterns will form, okay, by, you know, so this is what our universal phase diagram does. And here are my conclusions. I'm sorry, I think I took more time. So we can explore the novel rheology of this particular aging colloidal suspension to create a range of interfacial patterns. You can see how the introduction of oil rather than water made a huge difference. That is because of the non-zero interfacial tension at the interface. And these are extremely interesting because, like I told you, in some situations you need the instability sometimes, to kind of hasten the flow of, the displaced fluid. And in some cases, you want to actually stabilize the interfaces. Okay. So, yeah. Thank you for your attention.
So I'm now kind of jealous. Why don't I do experiments? Okay, so we have time for just one quick question.
Yes. Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, so temperature doesn't matter here at all. So this is, so here see, because I told you there are these electrostatic, okay. So we are really looking at, the flow of clays, right? So the flow of clays here, it is dominated not by thermal stresses, but by the very much stronger electrostatic interactions. So even, whatever the temperature you work on, you see the same things. So in that, so yeah, in that context, you can call it athermal.
But if you do experiments not at the room temperature, but high temperature,
Then the speed at which you're forming your patterns will change.
that's
But the sequence, the patterns will be there, the sequence will be similar. Or, suppose you don't see, sometimes it's difficult to get everything within the same, parameter space. In that case, you can change other things. For instance, the flow rate of the displacing liquid, the elasticity, but you can get everything.
Another question?
Okay.
In fact, I have many questions to get back to.
We can talk later then. Okay. So we also work on desiccation cracks. Okay. Okay. Shall I?
Yeah.
Is the charge in time?
No, no, no. So well, I mean, we have used for the water, we've dyed the water with rhodamine, which is a plumber's dye, and for the oil, we've used this oil red. It's a hydrophobic dye.
Okay, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Previous slide.
Yeah.
So the very bottom one, when there's dendritic structures,
Wait. Okay. Wait. How do I? This one?
the previous one.
Okay.
I think there was one with the dendritic after that.
No, then dendrites are well here. These are kind of dendritic here.
At 1 hour,
1 hour.
it patterns at 1 hour, TW equal to 1 hour.
Okay. TW is equal to 1 hour. We don't get dendrites.
Okay.
Huh.
So, but those reminded me of just, a lot of theory has been developed for those kind of, roughness, etc.
Huh.
I was wondering if,
Yeah, so we have done all kinds of stuff, like looking at the roughness of the interface, using the overall width. They use it in these growth patterns, right? Yeah.
that has been studied.
Yes, I didn't have time to talk about that, but yeah. So that's one way of characterizing it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you, Ranjini.
Thank you very much.
So, of course, all of you know Ranjini Vishwanathan. So, but Ranjini obtained her PhD in chemistry from ISC, and then she worked at University of Arkansas and LML for her postdoc. And she is currently associate professor at Jonesy. Ranjini is also an experimentalist like Ranjini, and she is interested in understanding the behavior of transition metal dopants. So Ranjini has received several awards, and I'll mention only a few. These include Power Fellowship, Karnataka State C.V. Raman Award, MRSA Medal, and several others. So Ranjini, we'll start. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this invitation. And today I'm going to speak about doping in semiconductor nanocrystals. It's something that we've been working for a long time. So in this talk, I'm not going in depth on any of the topics. I would definitely be interested in discussing with anyone who's interested in knowing more, or if we could have new these things, dimensions to it. But I just want to expose to you the dimensions that we are already working on in these nanocrystals. So where is the, how do I, there's no keyboard. Oh, this one. Okay, before I get started with the talk, I would like to acknowledge the students who have been with whom I've done this work, who have extensively, actually, I'm just here to put up their work, and also my collaborators without whom this work would not have been possible, and the funding agencies. So what is the role of nanocrystals? When we see nanocrystals, we all like to see this image and believe that this is what is nanocrystals. This or similar such images in internet is very widespread. But when you come to reality, this is not what we deal with. We actually have every possible element in the world conspiring against us. So basically, you see all these bright optical properties, but they don't really have that. For example, the chemical environment can make, this is just a comic, of course, but the chemical environment can make a really big difference as to what is going on these nanocrystals. The surface states are literally a killer because they are very small and surface to volume ratio is high, because of which we do have a lot of effects from the surface. And it's a big struggle to actually find something wherein this are not dominated. The problem with surface states is not, if they're dominated by these surface states, the big issue is that they are not constant. So which means trying to expand it into devices is not easy, because from sample to sample they can vary. We cannot really control this surface. So we are one of the big struggles is to find something so that, for example, luminescence is not conspired by the surface states. So what shall I do is what this quantum dot is thinking about. How shall I make sure that my luminescence is not affected? And yeah, so this is where the doping comes in as a solution. So what happens is these dopants, most of these transition metal elements are extremely efficient in taking away the photoexcited electron on the hole, because of which it's so efficient. Why do the surface states or the chemical environment become so efficient? Because they're faster than the recombination rates of the host itself. But these dopants are actually faster in picking up than they may not be faster in emitting, but they're faster in picking up the electron on the hole, and they hold on to it very strongly without actually emitting it. So, for example, the high energy states are much more stable in these dopants than in the host. So, because of which they have continued to be a solution. And also the other thing is most of these dopants are all coming at a redshifted position, because they are in the mid gap region, because of which these dopants actually do not worry about concentration. Otherwise, most often what happens is if you're in a device, you add some, you have a very highly emitting material, you add into it, and then you see that it is actually coming out and getting reabsorbed by the same thing, and again coming out reabsorbed, so overall decreasing the efficiency, because you don't ever have 100% efficient device. So when it goes through several reabsorptions, it decreases. So now if it's much more redshifted, it cannot be reabsorbed. So doping has been touted as a solution for a long time in literature. And you do get luminescence, but that's not the only reason people try to dope these nanocrystals. They also have a lot of properties that are changing with the introduction of these dopants. For example, I'm going to give one example here for a dopant like copper, wherein it introduces this mid-gap states like this, and because it's an atomic-like state, it's not a bulk solid, it's a single dopant atom, it doesn't change as a function of size, and we see that as a function of size, the conduction band, valence band changes, but the dopant doesn't change. So whatever we could get here, the entire blue to orange, you can get it with the dopant as well, except that they are more redshifted. Because of this can provide very interesting materials. Also, dopants, most often the hosts are a D10 system, which means they're not spin-wise active. So these dopants provide one way of introducing high spin magnetic impurities in these quantum dots. And especially in zero-dimensional structures, it becomes more interesting because instead of having an extended wave function like this in the nanocrystals, in the bulk, which the interaction would be very minimal when it's extended. In nanocrystals, what happens is because the nanocrystal is small, the interactions are forced to be stronger, and so one magnetic impurity and spin impurity is not going to affect the overall system. That's not interesting. But what is interesting is if this magnetic impurity can interact with other host materials, making a non-magnetic system into a magnetic system. And that is what is more efficient in nanocrystals. In fact, we have very recent work, which I'm not presenting here, it's that recent, which is being done by one of my students, Shubham, who is in the audience. And he has shown that actually when you look at this nicely integrated diffuse system, you can show that it integrates very well with the nanocrystal itself, and this one spin of one dopant can translate into the spin of the entire nanocrystal. Whereas if it is clustered together, then you cannot do that. So it's a very interesting work which I'm not discussing here. But when we try to do nanocrystals, how do we introduce these dopants? This is the first big challenge that most of us face. You do nanocrystals through top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. But in all cases, when you try to introduce this dopant, because these nanocrystals have very few atoms, they act as, even introducing one dopant atom is a huge percentage. In bulk, when you are talking of dopant impurities, we are talking of 10 to the power of minus 19, 10 to the power of minus 20, which means one atom in 10 to the power of 20 atoms. But we do not have 10 to the power of 20 atoms in a nanocrystal. We have probably hundreds, at best 1,000 or 10,000, and one atom is substantial level of increase in the impurity. And the best thing that the molecule does is to throw out the impurity because it cannot energetically maintain it. So dopants are important. You can see this guy here. There is overall one direction, one emotion. They're all in general working nicely, but impurities and defects like this are present and very important. They can actually change the overall status of this entire crowd. But when I take it in a smaller group, what happens? You can see that there is kicking, pushing, every direction. It doesn't look like a coherent team at all. So putting in anything more is becoming more and more difficult. So what we did in our work was we said, okay, if the nature doesn't want to come inside, which is because of energetic constraints, which people normally have been doing, it tries to diffuse and throw it out. What we will do is we'll use nature. We will say that, okay, I will take a cluster of these dopants and heat it and overcoat the host at the same time. By nature, this, because of heating, this one doesn't like to stay there. It will diffuse out. And it will diffuse out, eventually everything will go out. But we can now control it at various stages so that when it is halfway in, they are not in clustered forms, but rather in diffused, nicely diffused manner. And this is a cartoon which I typically use, like they can actually learn by osmosis by doing this. And we did obtain iron doping in CDS and many others, and this was one of our first works and in this direction, but we've used this technique for many others. So what we do, we start with iron oxide and then keep overcoating CDS, and eventually we see that iron oxide is completely diffused. We have nicely sputtered iron in the CDS lattice. I'm not going into details of how we proved that, but this is indeed possible. So what are the challenges now that we have? Let's assume that we have some of our materials. What are the challenges that we address? The various challenges that we address is, the first thing is, as I told you, they may not immediately emit. These are in general D to D transitions, which means they are orbitally forbidden. Many of them are also spin forbidden. So which means they are in general slower than your host recombination. If at all they are going to recombine. They are anti-selection rules. But when does nature break these selection rules? And understand how it does that, because nature is not prone to breaking their its own rules. So why does it do and how does it do? And also the second thing that we look at is use these dopants to understand the pathway of the charge carrier and hence understand the mechanism of polarization of these emissions. Because some of these emissions, as it is their forbidden emissions, they're not even allowed to come down, but they come down polarized. Why should it come down polarized? And what is the pathway of this charge carrier? Many times these dopants can act as an internal guide for us to say where is this charge carrier going? What is it doing there? How long is it spending in each of these channels? And how is the overall emission happening? And what are the paths for the deep trap states and how do they stay there? How sharp are these so-called atomic-like states? Do they have any effect because of the density of states on its properties? Are ensemble measurements different than single molecule measurements? Because ensemble measurements is what you get total of all the properties put together. Sometimes it hides your real single molecule measurements because there are so many of them and together they look different. But if you take each one of them, they can show in different properties. So these are the things that we try to address, some of the things. And the tools that we use typically, other than absorption, PL, spectrometer, etc., are transient absorption, wherein we look at absorption in the transient phases. These are typically occurring in timescales of hundreds of femtoseconds to a few picoseconds. Any absorption phenomena or any relaxation of the absorption phenomena is short-lived. And the other thing I already told you is a single molecule spectroscopy, wherein you can see that there are these this thing that you use that you can see that overall it's very broad, but it is actually made up of very sharp peaks. And what is the origin of these two peaks? Is it from single molecule or is it coming from two different features? And which can also tell you how bright it is, how long it stays, etc. So these are the two major tricks of tools of the trade that we are using, and to some extent photoluminescence and also magneto-optics, wherein we put in a magnetic field and try to understand what is the optical behavior just to understand the spin. Okay, so coming to one such example which we worked on extensively is manganese emission. Not only this has been a problem for the last 20 years. We see that manganese emission is forbidden, but it still happens. It has been observed in the bulk systems that, okay, when this is greater than, when we apply a magnetic field, there is no pathway for spin and orbital relaxation, the selection rule, so it doesn't happen, but it does still happen. And it's not only happening, but it happens such that these are the manganese emission. You can see at 2.15 eV. These are not bandage emission. You don't see in nanocrystals a bandage emission, irrespective of whatever field you go to. We've even tried as high as 55 Tesla, not in JNC, but in other places. But you can see that they're clearly actually not only present, but they are polarized, both in terms of actually the position as well as the intensity. So this is very interesting. Then once we try to understand it from a transient absorption point of view, we realize that actually when you go to nearby, we could actually see this second peak. This is the bandage absorption. And we see that there is this new peak which arises at the cost of bandage. And this is actually the absorption of manganese. And it suggests that possibly there could be a transition from a temporary short-term transition, few femtosecond long-lived, to manganese 3+, wherein it absorbs the, which takes up the whole, becomes manganese 3+. Then there are some allowed transitions, which makes the absorption allowed. And then again, the electron comes back, it is a manganese 2+. It's not a very allowed transition. It comes down in few microseconds to milliseconds time scale. And you can see very clearly here, not only that there is a very quick fall. If you look at the rise, this PBB, which is the manganese peak, is actually not growing instantaneously. It is growing at the cost of decay of this PBA path. So manganese is something which is never happy with all the attention that it gets. We thought that we had solved this, so much of questions. Have we solved this puzzle actually? But then we again came up when we started with perovskite manganese doping, we started seeing new anomalous observations. And the first thing what we saw was that we actually saw, when you looked at the quantum yield, you see that you don't see a manganese emission. First thing we think that, okay, manganese is not being doped. But if you look at the, compare it to the undoped, you see that there is a large increase in, substantially large increase in the quantum yield of the bandage emission, not the manganese emission. So what is happening? Where is this manganese emission? You can see that manganese emission is not there. It's zero, but it is still increasing the quantum yield of the host. What is this manganese doing? So when we try to probe more and more and looked at the very long-lived part, like I talked about the absorption in the earlier case, now we look at the emission, and what we look at is, we know that manganese is a forbidden emission, so we look at only the long time scale, what happens, not the short time scale. Then we see that there is these emissions. You can see that not only manganese emission, but you also see bandage emission, which is typically decaying in a few nanoseconds, still available after a few microseconds. And we see that this manganese is holding on to this electron and slowly drip feeding it to the bandage and increasing the quantum yield of this. And this was also actually proven by Raman to show that. So yeah, manganese is something very interesting. Today also, I don't think manganese era is over. We still get new anomalous properties. Similarly, iron, which was thought about as very boring because first thing, it kills the luminescence. It doesn't, it picks up this electron and the hole so fast, but there is only one single state, which is magnetically allowed. So it cannot calm down. So basically it kills all luminescence. There is this acceptor state. But when we try to look at it, we see that actually in the very short time scale, we could see that there were Fe spin states which are higher in, which could actually be, they were accessible to magnetic states, and the magnetic behavior was different for the upspin and the downspin. And this we again obtained from the transient absorption measurements, which I'll show very shortly. And it was also, once we tried to understand this, this was predicted by Professor Wagmar and his group, that okay, actually the spin down excitation of a spin down system is different than a spin up system. Actually one of them is completely dispersed around the entire nanocrystal, while other one is concentrated only on the iron acceptor states. And this is only valid when the iron is not interacting with another iron. If the iron is interacting with another iron, then everything gets equalized. There is no spin dependence. And with this, we could actually see that there was a difference, and we came up with signatures of a long-lived magneto-optical Stark effect. What is magneto-optical Stark effect? This is actually something we put up this term for the first time. Stark effect is well known. But magneto-optical Stark effect was actually Stark effect driven by magneto-optics. So that was some details which I'm not going to go into. Kavita, how much time do I have? Okay. So I'll just briefly, so basically what happens is when you excite it, you see that there is a difference in the two levels because of the energy as long as the pulse is there, and because of which you see that there is a difference in the two absorption, and so you see a different, if you take a difference between the two, you will see a differential like feature. And this is, it can be an optical pulse, it can be an electrical pulse. So based on optical or electrical pulse, these are all transient in nature. For the duration of the pulse, people call it optical Stark effect or electrical Stark effect. But in our case, we see that the spin is the case, not the optical and electrical, because of which we could actually get this magneto-optical Stark effect. It generates the presence of two magnetically inequivalent states, and because this is internal, not an external pulse, this is very long-lived, and it was alive as long as we could observe, which is 1000 picoseconds, 1 nanosecond in this case. So it was alive, and it's an internal perturbative field produced by magnetically active iron. And I'm not going, it does, we know that if this is true, we know that it should not, it should look different for resonant and non-resonant conditions, and I'm not going to go into details of that. The last part that I am going to look at is the copper doping, which I started by introducing this. And this is a very interesting debate that goes on whether copper is in its 2+ state or is it in 1+ state. So the point is copper 2+ is a D9 system and 1+ is a D10 system. And you see that if it's a D9 system, there is an optically active hole waiting for it to capture the electron. If it's a D10 system, then it cannot take any more electrons until it takes the hole from here, makes it into temporarily D9 system, and then accepts the electron. So which one is it? So basically, the question is, this is a copper peak. This is a bandage peak. Is this copper peak, is this bandage peak coming because of interaction and competition between the copper levels, or is it coming because it's the undoped counterpart? If it is a D10 system, it has to come because it's an undoped counterpart, because copper, there's only one electron and one hole. But if it's a D9 system, you have one electron and two holes. It can come from the competition. But what is the origin of the competition? Because, this is actually, as I told you, all these transition metal transitions are all very slow because they're orbitally forbidden. But the same is not true for bandage emission. So that what defines it. So basically, one of the things that we found out was actually if you take away this hole through surface states, then it cannot participate in this thing. Then this copper will do this. But is it really true? One final answer that everyone is looking for is, like, for example, if I look at manganese, you see that it's always at 580, but one such study showed that, okay, it's not like that. It's actually sum of all of these things, and you can actually tune it between blue to orange depending on the strain. So is copper also doing something like that? So we just tried to do that, and we see that we are, this linking is basically to prove that it's a single molecule. And same is true for this anti-bunching. If there is no peak at 0, then it means it's a single molecule. And we see that we actually see these two peaks even in a single molecule, suggesting that it's a copper 2+ system. So basically what we are trying to say is these are all multifunctional materials with interesting optical and magnetic properties with high efficiencies. Preparation is a task, but if you manage to get that, you have a lot of questions that can be that raises more and more fundamental challenges. For example, what is the oxidation state of copper? What is the origin of luminescence quenching in iron? What are the excited state pathways? What are the mechanism? Origin of the spin forbidden excitation and emission in manganese quantum dots, polarization in manganese emission, and so on and so on and so on. I just tried to touch upon a few points here just to give you the flavor of what we are working on. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. By the way, this is not the internet picture. This is what we prepared with 100% quantum efficiency.
Thank you, Anthony. We have time for some questions.
Yeah, mic is there only, Shobna.
Questions? Comments? Yeah, everything was clear. And anyway, they know you, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fine. So thank you, Nandini. Okay, so next speaker is Professor Geeti Hassan. So Geeti obtained her PhD from University of Cambridge in 1983, and she was a faculty at NCBS until recently. Currently, she's a SARB Distinguished Fellow at NCBS. So Geeti's research interest is in neuroscience and neurodegeneration, and she also has a lot of honors to her name. She's a fellow of Indian Academy of Science and Indian National Science Academy. She was also elected vice president of INSA recently, and she also holds honorary fellowship of the Karnataka Science and Technology Academy. So it's a pleasure to have you. Start.
Thank you, Kavita, for this invitation. Very delighted to be here for my first in-person meeting after 2 years. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to all of you about our work. I'm going to try and sort of present a broad perspective of what we've been doing over the years. So some of it is recent, some of it is longer, quite old work. The question that, as the title states, is the genetics of spinocerebellar ataxias, and does intracellular calcium signaling hold the key to this? Understanding intracellular calcium signaling. So I thought, since the audience is diverse, I'll first begin by just introducing spinocerebellar ataxias to you. So this is what happens in a spinocerebellar ataxia. You essentially, people who suffer from these are rare genetic disorders, and they happen so there are actually a large number of genes that cause these disorders, but they are mostly genetic. And the main effect is that you are not able to perform coordinated movements. And that is probably the earliest effect that is seen. It is a neurodegenerative disorder, so it happens as people age, and you can see that in this person. So it develops usually in most people that have these kind of disorders, it happens after the age of probably 40 or later. But of late, what people have also found with more and more genetic testing, that it can also happen in younger children. And the kind of genetic changes that happen there are just more severe. So the spinocerebellar ataxia is, as I said, it's caused by about 40 different kinds of genes. And 40 different kinds of SCAs have been identified, and 18 different kinds of genes. So that means that 18 different kinds of proteins that are not necessarily very closely related to each other. So some of them are ion channels. These are channels that are present on the surface of membranes, which let in various ions like sodium, potassium, calcium into the cell, into nerve cells. So it could be those kind of ion channels. It can be RNA binding proteins. So these are proteins that bind the RNA that makes proteins in the cell. Or it could be factors, again, another kind of protein which causes the RNA to be expressed. So these are called transcription factors. Or these could be protein modification enzymes. So enzymes that change the properties of proteins so that they are either more active or they're degraded or, make different kinds of changes. So essentially this has caused, it has led to a very poor understanding of what it is that causes spinocerebellar ataxia exactly at the molecular level. Because so many different things cause it, and the effect that is seen is more or less similar, as I showed you. It can vary in severity and it can vary in terms of age, but it is more or less similar. And it seems to actually affect the same kind of cells, which I'll come to a little later in the talk. So the real point is to try and understand it. Is there an underlying common cause that can be identified? And one of the reasons that we are so interested in understanding this is because, in fact, at this point, there is no way that anybody who's diagnosed with spinocerebellar ataxia can be treated. So there are some prophylactic measures in terms of, doing some exercises or feeding vitamins or some antioxidant treatments and things. But in actual fact, there is no real treatment that is available. So even if somebody is diagnosed with ataxias, there is not much that can be done apart from, as I said, exercises or just, taking care of certain diet. But medicines are not, there is no therapeutic drugs for it. So that is something that has been, at the core of trying to understand what is it that is underlying these kind of diseases. And of course, it's been worked on in many different ways. So where does intracellular calcium signaling fit in this? So what I'm showing you here first is the kind of normal calcium signaling that occurs in neurons. So it's known that ataxia arises from a neuronal disorder. It's a neurodegenerative disorder. And in neurons, what they do, what is known about neurons very basically is that they transmit information through electrical currents that pass through them. So you can see this would pass through a neuron, and it would reach what is called the point, which is the synapse, where the neuron talks to another neuron, where it would, as a result of these changes on the membrane, these membrane potential changes, you will get entry of calcium into the cell, into the synaptic cleft. And this entrance of calcium then leads to release of a chemical, a neurotransmitter, which will then bind to the other side of the synapse onto channels there, which will bring in again different kinds of ions. Sometimes these are also calcium. And as a result, there is a change in the membrane potential and the neuron, the signal is transmitted along the way. So this is what is normal calcium signaling, which is well understood in the context of neuronal function. It's been studied for many, many years. And it happens at sort of millisecond scales, because you can imagine that if you want a neuron to talk, in terms of any motor function, it needs to really function very fast. But there is another kind of calcium signaling, which is what we have been interested in, which we call intracellular calcium signaling. And this is something that happens at very much slower time scales. And in this, it's a little bit more complex in the sense that you have, here's your plasma membrane, which is shown here. And on this plasma membrane are present a series of receptors. Now, these receptors will bind all kinds of chemicals. They can bind neurotransmitters, they can bind neuropeptides, all kinds of small chemicals that are present in the intracellular fluid. And this will then activate an enzyme which will cause the generation of a molecule called IP3, inositol 1,4,5-trisphosphate. It's a phospholipid molecule. As a consequence of this IP3 generation, it binds to a molecule called the IP3 receptor, which is the key molecule that we've been studying in the cell. The IP3 receptor is a protein. It's also a channel. It's an ion channel, but unlike the channels that I talked to you about here, which are present on the surface, this is present inside the cell. It's present on what are called stores, calcium stores. So all cells have these calcium stores which are inside the cell. And I can discuss what the reason for these stores are. I won't go into it now. But as a result of IP3 binding to the IP3 receptor, you get release of calcium from these stores. And as a result of this release of calcium, you get emptying of stores, which become then depleted of calcium. Now, this sets up another molecule, which is called STIM, which is present also on the ER membrane, this store membrane. And STIM will then, because it binds calcium, the minute the calcium concentration drops, STIM changes, the conformation of STIM changes, and it actually begins to move towards the plasma membrane and then talks to a channel called ORI. And this channel will then bring in calcium into the cell, which will then be pumped back into the ER. So what you have then is a sort of cycle of calcium which is taking place. You have a signal which comes from outside. This causes the release of calcium to the cytosolic region. Calcium drops here. As a result of this, you need this calcium to be filled again. And this is done by this mechanism called store-operated calcium entry. It's called store-operated calcium entry because the store is empty and calcium needs to be filled into this through this mechanism called store-operated calcium entry. So this whole process, unlike what I talked to you about here, which happens in milliseconds, happens at a much slower pace. And this is something that we believe might lie at the core of slow neurodegeneration that occurs. So one of the things that we got very interested in trying to understand is that what is it that this calcium changes that happen at this slow scale in the neurons, what does it actually do? Does it affect ion channel function? Does it affect neurotransmitter release, which we've shown here? And does it impact neuronal health? And the reason that we got interested in trying to understand that is because one of the genes that causes spinocerebellar ataxia is in fact the IP3 receptor, which I talked to you a little bit earlier. Okay, it causes 3 different kinds of spinocerebellar ataxias, 15, 16, and 29, and then a related syndrome called Gillespie syndrome, which actually happens in quite small children. And one of the causes of these ataxias is an effect in the cerebellum, this is the human brain now that you're seeing here. This is a region called the cerebellum. And you can see that in a normal person, the cerebellum looks like this, whereas in an ataxic patient, it sort of degenerates with age and looks like this. And so this mutation in the IP3 receptor actually ends up causing degeneration of the cerebellar cells, which made us really think that there must be some connection between intracellular calcium signaling and the functioning of the cerebellum, and in terms of the cells that are involved there.
Because single mutations or there is 18 mutations?
No, so in this particular, so individual of those 18 mutations can cause this same. No, not together, as one mutation. So there is SCA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that. There are 40 different clinical syndromes which are called SCAs. Okay, they are named differently.
How many mutations are there?
One, a different gene. Yeah, 40 of them. Not all the genes are known. Okay, so in only 18 the genes are known, and out of those it turned out that in 18 there were 3 that had the same gene mutation. They looked a little bit different, but it was the same gene, which is the IP3 receptor 1. Yeah. So so this causes neurodegeneration of the cerebellum. So to try and understand the neuronal function and to try and understand what does the IP3 receptor actually do in neurons, we have been studying this primarily in flies, in fruit flies, which is a very good genetic system to try and understand the cellular basis of IP3 receptor function and what does it do to neurons. So there are good reasons for that. You can see that there are much fewer neurons in the fruit fly brain. In fact, all of them have now been identified, and they've actually been mapped in terms of the genes that are recognized, that are expressed in them. This is compared to the human brain. The synapses are much fewer, so that allows us to understand the downstream mechanisms. And of course, the volume is much smaller. So for all these reasons, the fruit fly brain is a good place to study the IP3 receptor, and also, of course, the number of genetic methods that one can use. So the very first thing we did was to obtain mutants for the IP3 receptor, and this we actually did very long ago now, in 2004. And what you can see on the right, on the left, is a fly that has been tethered into this thing and given an air puff. And what it did was, as you saw, was that it moved its wings and it could fly. So even though these are not flying as in terms of actually moving, but they are able to fly in terms of moving their wings. And they do that for a long time. The IP3 receptor mutant, as you can see on the right, is not able to fly. And this was established by many different ways. We did this by bringing down the levels of the IP3 receptors, but we actually identified this particular change is actually due to a change in the IP3 receptor. So we have a change in intracellular calcium signaling in neurons, and we have a loss of flight. And what we really need to do now was to try and understand what were the flight-regulated neurons that were present. Because to try and understand what the IP3 receptor is actually doing inside neurons, what is it changing inside neurons, we really needed to understand which neurons were involved in this. And this is where, again, fly genetics really helps, because there are genetic tools which allow specific neurons to be targeted. And so these are some specific dopaminergic neurons which are in the brain of the fly. This is the fly brain that you're seeing here. And we could target these specific dopaminergic neurons, which we identified through several other means, and try to understand how IP3 receptor and store-operated calcium entry functions here. So I will now talk, rather than the IP3 receptor, I'll talk about these two molecules, STIM and ARI, because in fact they sort of work together and change intracellular calcium signaling in pretty similar ways. So just to remind you again, this is the pathway that I talked to you about, and this is what you find, what happens when one is, okay, sorry, I would have liked to show this movie, but for some reason it's not, What happened? It's because of the pointer? Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is, I just want so this is the first burst of calcium that you see in the neuron was the IP3 mediated calcium release. And then the second burst that you see is the store operated calcium entry. So I just wanted to make the point that these two calcium changes happen very much in sequence with each other. And so for various reasons, we felt that we could actually use the IP3 receptor or STIM or ARI to study this whole process. And so what I'll talk to you now about is changes that we did in the fly brain using a particular mutation, which was in the ORI channel. This is the channel that brings in calcium. So this particular mutant version, we expressed it specifically in certain neurons, in certain dopaminergic neurons that I had shown you earlier. And what you find is that it gives a phenotype which is very, very similar to what we saw with the IP3 receptor. That is, this is a wild type fly which can fly normally, whereas this transgene, which is expressed specifically in dopaminergic cells, is now stops them from functioning. This is a version of the transgene which actually prevents the functioning of this ORAI channel. So which is why it is working in this way. And these are unable to initiate flight. So so this is the sets of neurons in which we are expressing this transgene. And one of the first things we noticed was that the expression of this transgene does not actually prevent the development of these neurons. So that was something that was a concern, because we're expressing this throughout the life cycle of the fly, and it's possible that the neurons were just dying. But in fact, what we found was that in the knockout of this SOC channel, the neurons were all there, they were all present, and they looked perfectly normal. So, but for some reason, even though they looked normal, this fly was unable to fly. So clearly there was some change that had happened in these neurons, which was not just a gross morphological defect, but was something more significant inside the cell, which was making it different. So to try and understand that, what we decided to do was to try and look at, if there are any long-term changes that happen with the loss of intracellular calcium signaling. And then could such long-term changes lead to neurodegeneration, which is what we talk about in humans. And then, of course, to try and understand the nature of these long-term changes. And one of these long-term changes that we began to wonder about, for various reasons, this is work from other people as well that had suggested that this intracellular calcium signaling can affect changes in gene expression, primarily done in non-neuronal cells. What people had shown was that this IP3-mediated calcium release in SOCE, they can actually talk to proteins which are present within the nucleus and actually prevent the expression of certain genes. And so what we wondered was whether there were changes in gene expression that were happening in these particular cells that we had identified. And to look at that, what Rishabh in the lab did, along with another student, Shresha, was to actually sort these cells out, because they are tagged with a green fluorescent protein and can be can be separated in the fluorescent sorter, cell sorter. We sorted these cells out and then did an expression analysis on this. And this was really interesting, because what we ended up finding was that there was a range of channels. This other what I've talked to you about are ion channels, which are the key, functional unit of neurons. And we found a large range of ion channels whose expression was changed in these cells. So these are sodium channels, these are potassium channels, these are chloride, voltage gated and ligand gated. All kinds of channels were downregulated in this SOC mutant version that I showed you, which told us then that these neurons, even though they looked normal, were actually not going to function very well, because they clearly had a huge change in their kind of channels that they were expressing. In addition, there were a number of other classes of genes that were changed, and one of them was, again, expression genes that affect the expression of other genes, which is called transcription factors, and then genes that were involved in synapse function and things like that. So this sort of gave us an idea that perhaps gene expression was something that was changing in cells where intracellular calcium signaling was changing. And what we obviously then wanted to know was, does this kind of thing, if it's happening in fruit flies, and of course we've studied it much further in fruit flies, but for today's talk, I won't go into that. What we decided then was to try and see whether we could replicate some of this work in mammalian neurons. And as a result of these changes in gene expression, what we wanted to know was, does it affect neuron function over time? Because clearly that was the key to trying to understand what is it that drives changes in, say, humans that have a loss of the IP3 receptor 1 gene. Why is it that they develop something like SCA at the age of 40 or 45? So for this purpose, we moved to mouse. We started studying the mouse neurons. And in particular, we started looking at the Purkinje neurons, so this is now a section of the mouse cerebellum. And what you're looking at here are Purkinje neurons, which are present in the mouse cerebellum. Now, why are we interested in the Purkinje neurons? It was already known that Purkinje neurons actually express a large amount of many of these genes. So what I talked to you about, STIM, ORAI, and IP3 receptor, 3 are expressed very strongly in Purkinje neurons. This was already known from many other people who had studied these neurons. And of course, they are present in the cerebellum, and that's very key to coordinating motor function. So it sort of made sense that Purkinje neurons were the cells that we started looking at in the mouse. So what Dhanya in the lab then did was to actually remove this molecule, STIM, which is shown here in green, from Purkinje neurons. And this is shown, the Purkinje neurons are shown here. And these are now in a version of the mouse in which the STIM gene has been removed. So she created a mouse in which the STIM gene was removed specifically from Purkinje neurons. And this, we have to do this because if you take out the STIM gene from the whole mouse, the mouse is dead. So you can't actually look at it in terms of understanding neurodegenerative function. So taking this mouse then, she did exactly the same experiments that we had done in flies. One of them was to look at their motor coordination. And so here are the mice which have a STIM knockout. They are the 3 mice on the right. And you can see that they are able to do this rotarod test at a lower efficiency than the wild type mice. So telling us then that there is a change in their motor function. And this is something that is also known for IP3 receptor 1 knockout mice in if they have a knockout in Purkinje neurons. That work has been done by other people, and we don't actually have that mouse, so we couldn't do that. We did it with STIM1. So clearly these mice are not being able to work very well. What then Dhanya did was to dissect these cells out and do a gene expression study, just like we had done in flies, and found a number of genes that were downregulated and upregulated. And among these, she validated about 20 genes. The important point, I'm not going to go into the classes of genes that she found. Some of them were ion channels, in fact. But I think the real important point that I'd like to make here is that what Dhanya was able to do was to actually check out these genes through age in mice. So mice, of course, live for much longer than flies, and we can actually do these kind of age-related experiments at a much easier way here. And what she found was that if you have these STIM knockout mice, and you look at their genes at 14 weeks, which is shown here, then there is no change in gene expression. So this is the normal mouse, and this is the STIM knockout mouse at 14 weeks. But the same gene, if you now look at it at 1 year, you can see that in the wild type mouse, it hasn't changed from here to here. But in the STIM knockout mouse, it's gone down. And so similarly, if you look at the next 4, you'll see that this one has gone down. Similarly, this one has gone down. Similarly, here and here. And so this she did for about 20 different genes. And she could show that all of them were actually changing in the level of expression with time. So at 14 weeks, they're fine, but over time, they went down. And the point then was that obviously, since these mice also show changes in motor function, we assume that their neuronal health is also getting worse with these gene expression changes that are happening. So, having reached this point, we were reasonably confident that gene expression does have something to do with the neuronal health, and that intracellular calcium signaling actually feeds into this into gene expression and neuronal health. But what we really then wanted to try and understand was that can modulators of intracellular calcium signaling be used to revert, because that is essentially what would be interesting to do using these kind of genetics, that can one actually revert these changes in some way? Are there modulators that can do that? So basically, if you're saying that, store-operated calcium entry has gone down because you've reduced STIM, then is there a way that we can raise store-operated calcium entry? And is there a way that we can revert the changes that I'm talking about so far? So to do that, we then went back to another molecule that we had worked with in flies, which is called septin-7. And septin-7, what we had found, was it's a sort of a small filamentous protein which which interacts with the plasma membrane. It has phospholipid binding regions to it. And what it seems to do, and it's not really very well understood how it does that, is it seems to somehow keep the uri, if you reduce the levels of septin-7, then it somehow allows the oral channel to remain open a little bit more and allow a smaller, some level of calcium entry, which improves over if you don't have STIM functional, or so essentially it seems to sort of help out with store-operated calcium entry if it's reduced to a certain level. And on top, yeah, I'm nearly done. So what we did was we had checked this in flies. And here's an IP3 receptor mutant fly that's not able to fly. So you've given it an air puff, and you can see that it hasn't flown for 30 seconds, and it will not fly at all. Whereas if you reduce levels of septin-7, you can see that these flies, their wings are not visible. That's because they're moving them. They are able to fly. And this is also true if you reduce septin-7 only in neurons. And this has been quantified here. So what we then wanted to do was do exactly the same experiment in mice. And this is what Dhanya did. She then made a double mutant, which is what she had done was she had removed STIM from Purkinje neurons In the same Purkinje neuron, she now removed septin 7. And she removed either one copy of septin 7, which is shown here, or both copies of septin 7. And because that we were not sure how well the neurons would be able to handle the loss of septin 7, so she did it with both types of things. And you can see that septin 7 levels have come down in one copy as well as in 2 copies. And then she went on to look on whether these genes that we had, some of the genes that we had looked at, how their expression was changed. And this was, I think, the biggest excitement in the lab, because what we found was that many of these genes that had been downregulated with time, if you reduce septin 7, either one copy or 2 copies actually, either of them, many of their expressions came back. So they were now expressing to almost normal levels, except perhaps in this case, but even here it was better than what it was in STIM1, but it was not back to wild type. But in many cases, they were back to wild type levels. Now, this is not true for all the genes. This was true for something like about, out of the 20 genes that we tested, it was true for about half of them, that we could see that they came back. But of course, the main thing then was to see whether, they are able to, these mice are actually able to get back on the rotarod and how well do they do there. And that is again something that was really exciting, because what we could see was, so this B is what is the STIM knockout condition. And you can see at 17 weeks, which is when these were tested, the mice which have got one copy less of the septin 7 gene are a little bit better than the STIM knockout, but not hugely better. And they're certainly not back to wild type levels. But with age, what you can see is that they are actually almost the same as the wild type. And that is seen here. So essentially telling us that not only did the reduction of septin 7 help in improving the function of gene expression, it helped, but it also actually brought back motor coordination. And this is the movie that shows that very nicely. So you can see the STIM knockout has fallen off, whereas the septin 7 heterozygote is still functioning. So is the septin 7 knockout. They're still up there, as is the wild type. So in fact, it actually could improve motor coordination in these mice. So finally, what we'd like to do now is to be able to do this in, check whether it's similar things are happening in human neurons, and we're generating human neurons from neuronal stem cells. And this is just a preliminary slide. And what is exciting is that at least some of the changes that we see in calcium signaling that we found in mouse neurons and in Drosophila neurons do show up in human neurons. We haven't been able to do all the experiments yet, but this is some of the work, initial work. And what you can see is that septin 7 knockdown does improve calcium entry into human neurons as well. So I'm very hopeful that this work would actually allow us to try and find ways by which we can improve calcium entry into human neurons by inhibiting septin 7. I'm talking to people who have septin 7 inhibitors, and we hope to start testing them in flies over the next year or so. So I'll stop here, and I'll now show you the people who did this work. So I think I've already talked about that. So this is at a wedding of 2 of my students, which was in Kerala. So this is Steffi, the bride, and Trambak. So this is a nice this thing of national integration, I think, because Trambak is from Gorakhpur and Steffi is from Kerala. And they are married and now living in the US at the moment as postdocs. And so the work that I talked about first, which was about the ORAI dominant negative, which we did in flies, that was done by Trambak. And a lot of the gene expression studies were done by Rishabh and Vishlisha, who are shown here. The septin work was begun by Dipon, who's shown here, and all the mouse work was done by Dhanya. So she single-handedly in the lab did all the mouse work that I talked to you about just now. The ITC receptor work, much of it has been done by Anamika. I didn't go into the details of it, but she's the one who did it. And Pragya is now following up on the septin 7 work in human neurons with help of Ranjita, who's shown here. She's not in this picture, but she's shown here, who's the expert in human stem cells in the lab. So with that, I'll finish, and thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I have a question then. This, you said you're doing it with the human neurons. How does that work? Like,
so you can get human stem cells, and you can differentiate them into neurons.
okay.
In the dish, yeah, in the dish, yeah. This is in the dish, yeah. That's what the image was of them in the dish.
This
Yeah.
genetics of this is simple, no? Because you said, I mean, for the Drosophila, for example, you showed it's a monogenic trait,
Right.
right? So it's just the heterozygotes which have the problematic ones.
That's right. Correct.
Ah.
Yeah.
Question? Yeah.
Does the deficiency of calcium, does other effect from motor neurons, like more directions other than that? Any memory effect is also there?
Memory.
Memory, something like that.
So we've never tested memory in our mutant flies, and none of the genes that I have that we know of in SCA, the ones that are related to human SCAs, none of them, as far as I know, cause memory losses, but some of them do have behavioral changes. Some of the people do show some sort of behavioral changes, but not memory as far as I know. Yeah.
Any question? I just wanted to 57 knockout by itself would have any
It didn't have, yeah. So it was a knockout specifically in Purkinje neurons, and we were concerned about that it would have, which is why we did the work with one copy loss. But it turned out that, at least in the test that we applied, we couldn't see any change between either one copy or two copies. Yeah, they both seemed to be the same.
Okay. So thanks, Katie. Once again.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll now move to the second part of this program. So may I request all the speakers to take us to the dais.
Okay. I'll just take my mask maybe.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is, one by one, each of the speakers, they can sit there and probably speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And the topic of discussion is what institutional and government policies helped in your career and the policies that hindered your career. So we will start with that, and please let the speakers speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll take the questions at the end of all the three speakers have spoken. Okay, so I think Ranjini, since you had some appointment, can you start?
Okay. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I haven't actually planned anything.
Yes, you have to get me. I just like you first because you had an appointment.
Yeah, she's like a.
So Geti, please, you can start. So I'll let you 8.
Okay, so I really haven't planned a 10-minute talk at all, but I thought I'll just think through some of the things that I feel are important in terms of working for a working woman. I think one of the things that so I'll talk perhaps what is the lack in institutions, which I think would really help people, and not just women. I think anybody who joins new and needs one of them is that we do not have formal mentorship programs in our institutes, in our universities. And I think this is something that we really need to start putting together. So there are informal ways by which mentorship happens. Informal way by which mentorship happens, but I think formal mentorship is something that hasn't been put in place. And I think particularly in the case of women that come into work, they tend to be a bit sort of defensive and perhaps not so confident. And as a result of which, I think this is something that if there is formal mentorship from people in the institute, or people outside the institute, whatever mechanisms are put in place, I think it would help a lot for allowing women to be able to be visible more. So I don't think this necessarily affects the way they work, because I think that part of it, women are very capable and are able to get their labs going, get their students start working. But I think when it comes to then projecting this work outside, being able to actually integrate with other opportunities that are available, I think that is where there is a lot of lacuna from, I think, women scientists in many, many places. And there, I think, is where one needs mentorship to allow people to be able to engage outside more carefully. Within the institute, I mean, there are very standard policies, I think, that are required, which I think a lot of institutes have now started putting them in place. Things like having a child care facility, that is important, and I think many places have put that in place, and it's very important. And these are changes that have happened over the last 20 years, and certainly for me, it was very useful having that facility, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of other people also. Allowing flexible working hours at various times. Most scientific institutes allow that, but universities don't, and so that is something that one needs to try and address a little bit. One of the things that I think does bother me is the fact that a lot of our faculty hiring and our the awards and things that are given out to people are still related to age, and those ages are mostly set thinking of careers of men. They're not really taking into account the careers of women that carefully. So now what, I brought this matter up once in some particular forum, and I was told that, oh, but there are separate awards for women. And I think that is possibly not the best way to do it. I think it's only fair that, everybody is judged under the same umbrella, if possible. I'm not saying that you don't have separate awards. If you would like to, that's fine. But it would be nice if everybody is judged in the same way. But that, there are some concessions made to the fact that many women do take 2 to 3 years off to have children and to look after younger children. So that is something that needs to be taken into account in terms of, what is called ageism. I think we do need to change these ageist policies in many, many cases. So I think broadly, I would say that's what I really wanted to bring up. There are maybe one or two other points that possibly one of the things that I think, so what can we do to change some of these things? One of the things that people have suggested is that, of course, try and hold more such meetings, get more people to understand these, that such policy changes are needed, but also to perhaps bring more women into decision-making roles. And this, again, is something that I've suggested at various times, but it has to be remembered that not all women that come into decision-making roles necessarily are able to be supportive of such policies. So it's quite often, it has happened, at least in my career also, it has happened that you can have women who are actually, because they have been put into a position where they are in a leadership role, and because they are now among, so one woman among 6 or 7 men, so they may not then feel comfortable to actually, or they may not even feel the need to actually push forward such an agenda. So one really needs to think these things through a little bit more carefully and really try and bring in, as I said, more and more women with obviously the correct ability into roles where they can then actually influence policy and influence change. I'm not sure that I really want to say anything else at this point, but I can contribute to others. Okay, so Gayatri pretty much said everything I wanted to, and I'll now talk about the mentorship because I agree that is extremely important. See, I come from a physics department where the number of women is very low. Right. And I mean, it would be very nice if, somebody would kind of show you the ropes. So this, I was part of something called the Global Young Academy. So they have a structured policy, where you can actually contact people anywhere in the world, to be a mentor. Now, of course, in the Indian context, it makes sense if your mentor is from India, right? Because, they know how things work. So, yeah, so that would be very good. And I mean, I agree with everything that Gayatri said. I mean, that would be wonderful. I don't believe that has ever been considered really. Yeah, so next, I mean, there are what policies have helped me very much, and there have been many that have been very helpful. I'm a 14-year-old, and so we have this very, very generous childcare leave. So till the time the child turns 18, you get 2 years of paid leave. And this is not just, this could be because of the ill health of the child, exams, whatever. And I was trying to avoid taking it because, I've heard these undercurrent, people saying, oh, she's more serious about her child than she's about her work.
Okay. But then, I saw that, so now my kid is in the 9th grade and, I don't have a choice because schools just declare exams. They don't give the school bus. And eventually I'm the one who has to, take leave and ferry her around. In fact, that I just, we just had one of those, I took leave for 10 days just before this. So in one of those meetings, I had actually said that, this childcare leave should be shared with the father. And I was met with peals of laughter. Okay, so on the other hand, if you take the leave, you're not serious. On the other hand, why should the father have to do it? Even if the father is willing, yeah, he's not the true, he's not the person who does this kind of stuff. So, yeah, but, so that would be nice. The other thing, of course, nowadays we also have a very generous maternity leave. Like Beti said, you do spend 2 or 3 years of your life, bringing up small children, sometimes more. So this is, the maternity leave is great. I don't believe India has a proper paternity leave policy. Okay, but that's how just things are. Now, there are certain things that have been very beneficial to me, and for that I'll say, the contribution is, of the ROI leadership that has actually been very committed to certain issues. So one of them, of course, was a childcare, like a creche. And for instance, we were just, given a free hand to have a creche, interview people we wanted to hire, we decided on how many people would be there, the timing of the creche, everything. RLI also has been, so they started off with 20,000 rupees a month to pay salaries, and the rest of the money was basically, it was raised from, the creche fees. So that has gone extremely well. We, of course, now we have used it, now we don't need it anymore because my daughter can, be on her own. The women's cell, the sexual harassment cell, people say these things can never happen in ROI. Okay, I mean, that's a slippery slope. But then, we are glad that the law mandates it because, at least you feel like, there is this promise of a safe environment. Okay, so this is a committee that needs to be strengthened. Okay, and then what else? Okay, so as far as, so the government also has several schemes for women scientists. RMI has been very gracious with money. I have never really had to go looking for, funds. And, as you know, it takes a lot of money to start an experimental lab. So I've never really had to, I do have grants, but I've never really, my research has never stopped because of, want of external grants. I think, I think what is really important is the leadership of the institution, right? I mean, the leadership should be trying to help you as much as possible to enable your research. Women in decision-making positions, I think that is very important because, again, in our institute, there are very few women, and unless there are certain women who are taking, women we have confidence in, who are there in the decision-making capacity, it's very difficult to ensure a woman-friendly atmosphere. For instance, I can just, I have had my work being explained to me by a male colleague who works on something very different. That's called mansplaining, right? There's also research that shows that a woman in a meeting is much more likely to be interrupted than, a man is going to be interrupted. I mean, what do you do? I mean, there's really nothing you can do that's going to make a big change, but call it out every time. Okay, so be a pain and just call it out that, this is not done. And and of course the government does come out with all these sensitization programs. It's, so somehow it's all only meant for women. So it would be nice if there were broader courses for, all employees. I mean, that would be nice. So RLI gives JMU degrees. And from last year, we have been asked to conduct an ethics course, so research ethics. So here, so we've developed the module. We do, research ethics, how to, it's also, it's about publishing, it's about, honesty while you're doing research, plagiarism, everything. We've also introduced a module on gender roles, where we just let, all the participants, just talk about, what they think. Men, women, everybody is just encouraged to speak out. So I think that was really nice because, we got to talk and we got to understand, what people are feeling, and, maybe the next time we will change the course accordingly. Okay? So, yeah. So, I mean, these are basically the things that I wanted to say. Awards, like AP said, yes, it would be nice if the ages were extended. They are all, the age limits are all, the standards, they are set by male standards. So, yeah, so I think that's what I had to say.
Yeah, coming after two very senior people, I don't think I have a lot to add, except to emphasize that, okay, formal mentorship can actually play a very good role. Age is something that I am having a late child, and it still matters that, okay, for all these, not only the awards, but also you take 5 years previous work, and if those 5 years happen to come within your childbearing years, then of course there will be not that much of productivity, so that does matter. And additionally, what I see, not really in my case but in general, is that this 35 joining time for women is actually quite difficult. I mean, I won't say in all cases, but most often in the Indian society, the husbands find a job first, and then the women try to find a job around that place. So, which means a little bit of relaxation for age for joining for the women would actually be, because as it is, this is a very long time scale running thing. So very efficient one can, I'm not talking of super efficient, but reasonably efficient ones can join around 32, 33, and if it's delayed further because of your husband being not getting the job, or you trying to find out around that place, that can be helpful. Of course, DCF, the daycare facility for children, is very useful. One thing that actually I must say that in my case, it was actually implemented taking Professor Vijayaraghavan's tweet from one of his, this thing by SN Bose Center, was that these daycares are typically meant for people who are here. But if as a woman traveling, specifically when you are feeding the child, you need to take the child with you. So we will accommodate your child in our daycare, because they allowed visitors' children to be accommodated, which I think can help a lot for women to travel and showcase their work. And the other thing that women can benefit from is, which I keep telling in most of my cases, it's not that the current generation, but the thought processes and government initiations that you can incorporate at a much younger age, which allows men and women to think that, okay, this is also somebody which we need to simultaneously, not specifically that, okay, they have to be treated differently, but right from the beginning, like let's say childhood, or even like high school or college level, how to treat these professionals as professionals, rather than treating as women professionals and male professionals, so that we bring up a future generation which is more oriented towards not saying that, okay, it's male dominated, the men have to get a position first, men have to get higher salary than women. All these things, it largely comes from mostly the family side as well, the societal pressures as well. If your husband is earning less than you are, the husband feels a little not so confident, and those things can be overridden by saying that by raising some initiatives right at a much younger age, so that when they grow up, they make, because I can see that a large concentration of men who are in academia are already, some of them are already gone past this stage, but when you see the general public, it is still that, and we need to really catch hold of not the people who are already in academia, but the people who were not able to get into academia, and for that we need to address this younger, the younger generation. And I think that's about what I wanted to say.
so much. So now we can really open it for discussion. So anybody has comments from what the speaker said, or you want to add something, any other policy you want to suggest, anything? Especially men. Speak up. So see, we are not going till 4:30.
Let me break the ice for men. Let me break the ice for men. Umesh is here, Nishwar is there. So, first of all, thank you. I'm thanking the resource persons for your wonderful presentations and participation in this event. Gati, at the institutional level, what we should be doing, we will be having a brainstorm session coming up soon. And I think we can take up these points to discuss in that on that platform. Some of them do not concern Gati, but should be spoken at the national level. We will remember them to take up as and when opportunity comes up in different platforms. I don't have anything specific to add to the discussion here.
Actually, one point that I missed out, which I think one of them referred to, but I think I would like to bring it up, is the fact that so sexual harassment is something which is sort of kept under the carpet, and at least in my knowledge, the few people who have come and complained to me about being sexually harassed have never made official
complaints. And essentially, women don't make official complaints because they always feel that they are the ones who will be targeted and not the man. And this is also, I think this is true, not just for, I think even male students who are being bullied by their supervisor hesitate to, talk about the supervisor. Would hesitate because you are in a very, very difficult situation. You are doing your PhD with somebody, and if that somebody is either bullying you or harassing you, it's a very difficult situation. So this is something, it particularly seems to affect younger women. I'm sure it affects young men also. They don't come and talk to me mostly. It's the younger women who've talked to me. And I do feel that is something that Indian science needs to start thinking about. We do need to start having policies of how to deal with this situation. Rather than just brushing it under the carpet for the student, finally it's a situation where they just want to get their PhD and get out. And that's what they mostly do. Get their PhD and they get out. But the person is still there. And that person continues to do the same thing over and over and over again. And that is not good because, a lot of people are then getting affected in a very bad way. So this is something I would really like if you are bringing this up at a national level, and I'm sure people are aware of this, but it does need, you do need to have policies that deal with this in some way, which protects the person who has made the complaint so that, they can actually, make the complaint. Because, as I said, in my life and all these years, the people who have complained have never agreed to make an official complaint, ever.
So I can just add something. So, so what Gati is talking about is the balance of power, like the supervisor and the student, and these things do happen. So one thing that RRI, we have a new director now who has different ways of doing things. So he is starting what he's calling an equal opportunities office with an ombudsperson. So, if there's a problem, like this is an external person, not an RRI person. So this person's, phone number will be given so that a student, who's being, for instance, bullied by the faculty can contact this person. And but one thing is, punitive action is very difficult. So what we probably have to do is, we have to have, we just need to make sure that these things don't happen in the first place. So maybe, I don't know, constant sensitization programs, some kind of, this constant conversation that needs to go on, between all the members.
Well, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with you about sexual harassment. So just this week, I was on a committee which was trying to formulate policies and a charter at the national level. It was mostly women on the committee, and
two of the most senior women on the committee were dead against mentioning sexual harassment as a problem faced by women in science. So even amongst women, there is not unanimity about this. I think there's still a lot of people who feel that it is not done to talk about this. This is, as you said, something to be pushed under the carpet. And we had to really, really fight to retain that, just to mention it as a problem faced by women, not even just, let alone, how to deal with it. They just said, oh, we can say gender bias. I mean, there is gender bias, but that is not the same as sexual harassment.
It's a criminal offense. I mean,
Yeah. And then they said, oh, but there are laws. So why should we mention it if there are laws? But the laws are clearly flawed. And the fact that there are laws doesn't mean that it isn't still a problem. So I think it is a very severe problem that we still haven't found the solution to. And the other thing, one thing that I noticed that both Geti and Ranjani didn't mention, maybe because they found solutions to it, is this problem of, the two-body problem of finding two jobs in the same city. This is something
have
that
a two-body problem.
So this is something that couples in science face a lot. So I was wondering if you wanted to say something about it.
I didn't have a two-body problem. I found my husband after I found my job, yeah.
I know that. But don't you think this is something that is
Yes.
a real problem for women in science?
Yes, so I agree, and there's also a lot of resistance to, hiring two people at the same place. And I think, the charters that we make, for gender empowerment, I think, they should consider, the two-body problem as a real problem. So we have heard all these horror stories where, basically the husband is first, gets the job, and then the wife is told, be a postdoc for a year and then we'll see. Never gets a job. The wife is then told, oh, your husband is given a car and he has given you a car and a driver, why do you want the job? So I suppose, we need to talk about these things, and I think two-body problems do happen, and, they have to be, placed in the same place. I think Ranjani has to go.
Okay, so let me just summarize. I think all the speakers also said that, just to just put everything together. So I think the sort of 3 points which I could make out is, first is to have this formal mentorship programs to boost confidence, to boost visibility, and to give you the confidence to speak up against sexual harassment and so on. Second point, I think, which is made here is just have more women in decision-making roles. And we have to start doing this early on, giving them voice, listen to them, and treating them as equal as a child. I mean, not just when you become a faculty or something. And the third thing, I think, is again, for better or worse, only women reproduce, and therefore, they have all these problems which come up. And so therefore, it's important that we have a paternity leave, which an equal responsibility at work and at home for both the parents, or male and female, having flexible working hours, this problem with the age and two-body problem, etc. So clearly, these are extremely difficult problems, difficult than the 3 problems that we heard in the beginning, in the morning, in the first session. And it will take a lot of discussion, and but I hope with Gati we'll probably make some small dent in this. So with this, I will close this symposium. So first of all, I will thank all the speakers, and of course all of you to come and listen to us. And special thanks, of course, to DST for allowing, supporting this event. And we'll be sending a feedback form, so it's essential that all of you please respond. It's really important, and because we have to use that information to give it to DST. So it's really important that you respond and give your feedback. And now it's time for tea, so please join us outside.